We have arranged the dates of the seminar so far for till the beginning of 2023. We do not have an exhaustive list of participants yet, but I hope that they will help the seminars in presenting our research that is directed towards conference, and especially to highlight the research that is undertaken by our postgraduate students. So we hope that it will contribute in this direction of solidifying the presentations of our research and helping later on academics and students to proceed towards publications. And we have two presentations today. One is by Dr. Anderson on qualitative research and random design in biomechanics, and by myself on the legacy of mega sport events from the point of view of participation and the effect on smaller groups and ethnicities. So I don't know if Girish wants to say something before we start.
If you want me to, Themis.
Girish, I can hear you.
I think everybody else might be able to hear me, but you can't.
No.
There might be a problem with your audio.
I can't hear you, Girish. You're muted or no? No. Leave it, Girish. Leave it. So we start. Okay. Yeah. So I'll just share the screen, yes? Okay. And,
Can the participants online here? Girish, I can see you. Stick a thumbs up or down.
I can hear you. Thank you.
Sheba, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. I can hear you.
People online can hear me. Or if they can hear me in the room. They make a quick start. So I'm Harvey Anderson. This presentation is probably as much a surprise to me as it was to the audience that I delivered it to in Liverpool in July. It came about from results from my doctoral thesis, but was kind of never really the intention to even, or I didn't even expect to kind of go down this route. It was also the only piece of qualitative research after a week-long conference at Liverpool in biomechanics, not surprisingly. The key area that this kind of reflects around is this idea of what's traditionally been known as ecological validity, but I'll argue as we go on in terms of more of representative experimental design. This idea that we want our experimentation to reflect what it is that we then are expecting to see in the sports field itself. Okay, so yeah, we recognise that this is what we're after. There's a recognition also that lab settings tend to have slightly different outputs than from sport competitions, which is kind of problematic. And then Pinder most recently has argued actually it's not really ecological validity that we're after. This is this idea about statistical correlation. It's actually, does it represent the behavioural settings that we're expecting these results to then be applied to later, i.e. sports competition. Okay, so that's kind of where we're going with here. So Pinder in particular argues that it's representative experimental design we're looking for. So the presentation is about, well, do we actually meet those needs? So a number of studies, Fox as an example here, noted that landing patterns, movement patterns in a lab setting are far different to a competition, almost unrecognisable. Even though this kind of the setup was supposedly the same, it was a netball game going on. As soon as we change the settings, something changes in what people do and what we're measuring. So that's pretty tricky. So the argument then becomes, why don't we just put everybody in in their sports environments and just record that. Well, the issue we've got, obviously, we know is the kit. If we want really high quality precision measurements, then we need the kit that can do that. For the kit to be able to do that, it needs to be in an environment where it's best able to do that. You can't just be sticking force plates and 3D motion capture systems in the middle of a rugby pitch, cricket field, and so on. So, not surprisingly, most of the research that's already been done in fast bowling has tended to take place in lab settings. So we'll have the kind of the inbuilt issues around that. Why am I interested in fast bowling? Well, in cricket, I know I'm slightly biased at being a former fast bowler myself, but they're the most important. They're the match winners. They make the difference in the game. They're also most likely to get injured. If we look at some of the money that's gone into things like the IPL, they're very, 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 very expensive assets that you can potentially lose quite easily. So understanding what kind of makes them injured, and depending on whose studies you look at, suggests there's a lot of injury. We need to know more about it. So getting the right type of data, the information that is going to tell us or help predict injury is really important and really useful to us. So we need that. Most of the stuff has been looking at the various biomechanical variables that relate to ball release speed or correlationally to long-term injuries. So do those bowlers who have had the most history of stress fractures, what positions do they get in versus those who haven't been? Okay, so up to this point, but it's also only taken within quite a short capture area. So they tend to look at the focus a bit as the ball comes in and lands with their back foot, all the way through to the point where the ball's let go. Okay, so we don't know what happens particularly before that. We certainly don't know what happens after that because we stop recording and we're worried about that. So it's only a small amount of data is currently being collected to understand what's going on. And the big bit that's really tends to be missing, because we're looking at things like the impact on release speed, game context is taken out of it. So quite often in the experiments, bowlers will be told to bowl as fast as you can, or just bowl like you would in a game. It's quite different to actually bowling in a game. So as part of the doctoral process, I also did a systematic literature review. A couple of papers that I found, the ones that really looked at the consistency of a bowling technique, suggested that bowlers don't change their technique either in a game during a spell or across a season. These are the only two papers I could find that looked into the consistency elements. However, we've got to know young kids basically being told to just run in a ball at match speed. The young kids who are only likely to play in 20 over cricket. They're not going to be playing 4- and 5-day games. They're not going to be playing T10 games. They're not going to be playing 3-day games. So what's expected of them at this age is probably quite limited from a tactical perspective versus what we might see in elite top performance. So these are the only papers that have really covered that. And the issue for me, I think that I didn't mention at the beginning, is I've been a cricket coach for 30 years. Been a fast bowler myself, played at first class level. That doesn't reflect reality at all. So I've already kind of going into this study had this question in mind of, well, the papers are saying that, but I don't think that's true. From my own personal experience, now I might be a freak and one-off, who knows? So let's go to the experts. Number of papers out there, particularly involving Keith David, suggesting that experts, both as players and coaches, can be really, really important and impactful in terms of giving us information for what we should measure, why we should measure certain things, why certain things are kind of more important than others, and gives us kind of real insight into hopefully making this experimental design more representative, which is what we were arguing about at the beginning. So this came out of a larger study looking at how expert coaches coach fast bowling, how they coach the technique, and how do they know what the technique is or should be, and how to go about coaching. Where does that kind of knowledge and information come from? So as I mentioned, it's the only qualitative study at the conference. I interviewed 20 top-class fast bowling coaches. They all had to be working with first-class and international bowlers for a period of time and hold a professional position in doing that. Semi-structured interviews, all recorded. Key question areas were ideas around, is there an ideal fast bowling technique? What's a good one? What's a bad one? How do you coach it? And how do you know both of these things? Where does that knowledge come from? And from there, qualitative research on thematic networks. I won't bore you with it, it's just a structural diagram in terms of the themes that have come out of it rather than your normal chatted tables. And obviously, not specifically looking much in terms of biomechanics. So the key things that came out that were really useful in terms of this area that the coach mentioned a lot about was this idea about individualization. Everything was very, very individualistic when it came to fast bowling, according to the coaches. You could not do one thing with one player that would work with another. Certain tactics and approaches and certain techniques that some bowlers use were appropriate for some and not others. And that a lot of the stuff that went around the game made a huge difference in terms of the variations that came about. So coaches noted that bowlers changed their technique both in games and across the season. And they knew this because they were having to make coaching interventions to correct them. So bowlers were kind of cropping up with different mistakes or changes in their actions and so on. So some of the examples they gave to kind of prove that this was happening, I want to suggest these kind of things would happen. So the alignment. So we have cricket with the stumps, and obviously one side of the stumps where you can bowl or the other, and the batter stood at the other end. So the angle in which you approach, whether you get close to it to bowl forward or come wider, around the wickets, all make a huge impact in terms of the angles you go through the crease. The batter doesn't really change that much from where they are. So I can be in that position relative to the batter, or that. It massively changes the amount of rotation I'm going to need to where I release the ball. So they're quite noticeable changes in what's going on in the body. Different in terms of postures, arm positions, I'm getting closer, getting wider, changing the actual hand around. The ball coming out from there to there. Again, big differences in terms of how they're releasing the ball. Quite often, they're also trying to camouflage what they're doing. So again, having to move their body around to hold the ball away, so the batter can't see what type of delivery that they're going to bowl. So again, this becomes another change that the bowler are having to do that. Run-ups and so on. And the coaches argued that this comes about because of the game. Other things we mentioned, things like follow through. So once they've let go of the ball, there's a massive difference bowling a ball to somebody who's just tapping the ball back to a guy who's standing there absolutely smashing it straight at you. There's a fallacy of desire to get your head and take your head towards the ball, if that's the feeling. So again, lots and lots of different things that coaches are seeing that we're not measuring. And that's quite problematic. Because if we're not measuring it in the lab, where are we getting our data from? Where can we actually challenge some of the approaches that are being used? We don't know anything about follow-through. We can't necessarily coach the follow-through, and the follow-through occurs from everything else that we've done beforehand. But it might be that we actually have to change the delivery stride to ensure that the follow-through phase is safe. Or we make the decision, keep doing what you're doing because you're getting great release speed and great results, but you're going to have a shorter career. Again, we don't have these answers. So some of the things that came out was there's a complete lack of tactical and contextual information being put into the design the studies in the first place. Coaches are telling us we need a game. We need some tactical imperative. We need a batter. It's an interaction between bowler and batter. It's a very, very different game without a batter. We're not seeing that in the studies. And it matches the Fox's paper in that, yeah, techniques do change. This idea that everything's very, very, very individualistic and you can't average across. Got the name of, there was a study in this around about the 60s, the American Air Force, and they created the average cockpit, and for the average fighter pilot. And then they studied and looked at the 2,000 plus fighter pilots that they have, and not a single one of them actually fits the cockpit. So although they'd averaged all of the respective measurements, not one single pilot fitted that. We've got exactly the same thing going on with cricket. We're getting these measurements across bowls and saying, well, this position is good and this is good and this approach speed is really, really good, averaged out across these bowlers. But we're not going, that suits that bowler, doesn't suit that bowler. The coach is saying we need to do that. So again, we're already seeing some real issues in and around this kind of idea about individualization. So recommendations that come across. There's already been a couple of studies, again, Keith and Renshaw, looking at where an umpire stands. So we know that a bowler modulates their run-up approach and where they jump from, depending on whether an umpire stood there. There isn't a single study so far in the empirical literature that has had an umpire. There isn't a single study that's had a batter at the other end. Kind of important that. Danger area. Again, this protected area. So in cricket, we have a rule. Comes around about that second foot comes through the area you cannot step on the wicket. Different bowling techniques, depending on where you bowl, are more likely to pull you in a straight line down towards the centre of the pitch, and then having to pull themselves off. So off to the side. Does that have an impact or not on our bowlers? I believe it probably does, but again, we're not measuring it. We don't know. Biggie, have a batter. Bowlers bowling at a batter are very, very different to bowlers without. If any of you ever watch a bowl off, which is kind of the cricket version of a penalty shootout, they take the batter away and the bowler runs in and tries to hit the stumps. And invariably, the bowlers miss the stumps quite often. Put a batter there, you've probably got more chance of hitting the stumps because, again, bowlers modulate A from where they jump the umpire, but B, their release points what the batter's doing. Take the batter out, it's a different task. We need different game scenarios. So yeah, bowl as fast as you can is great for looking at the kinetic variables that match to release speed. But how do we know that bowling half a dozen different slow balls does or doesn't impact on spinal injuries or shoulder injuries? Again, we're not measuring this, so we don't know. We've got these bowlers all doing these kind of things. We can't tell the difference. So the coaches talked at length about their interventions. So one of the guys in India talked about coaching interventions being periodized along with the fixture calendar. So he knows full well that white ball series, IPL, I'm going to be working on this type of delivery. I know now I have this number of weeks before the red ball season starts, this other type of delivery is more important. So I know I need to fit my coaching interventions to fit that. Again, we don't have any of this recorded. So yeah, ideally, I'd actually like to see this happen on a cricket pitch in the game. So things like markerless detection systems and so on are really, really important in cricket going forward. We need game-like scenarios to take place. So the findings are kind of to conclude. Different competition types have different imperatives. With different tactical imperatives brings about different techniques. Unless we take that into account to our research, we're not measuring what's happening, which is a problem. Implications for biomechanical researchers is how do we make research more like a game? So it's all right, Harvey saying, yeah, go and have a batter there. I'm in a biomechanics lab with lots of expensive equipment. I can't have a batter going smashing a cricket ball around it. So how can I set it up in an environment where that's okay? Where it can put netting in to protect it, where it's actually going to be big enough to have a bowler running in 20 yards, plus your 22-yard pitch. Or about having a wicketkeeper and umpire and so on. It's not easy, but the more we can actually start to work towards this, the more realistic data collection becomes, the more valuable our results become. And yet, finally, this idea of biomechanists and coaches working together to actually come up with the structure of the experimentation. And that's it. Any questions? So on chat. Donna's only loud and clear. Good. Any questions anyway?
I have a question. If everything that you find out on these designs on research is only applicable on the recent basis, then is it possible to have a generalized conclusion?
It becomes quite tricky. You can do, but it's got to be more case study based. There's ideas of having large trials and going right, well, we've looked at the top 50 fast bowlers, and they all have these key attributes, which is what the ECB have done recently. So they have what they call the fast bowling matrix. Looked at a number of studies and concluded that these 4 factors are the key things you must go and do that. One of them being a brace front leg. Since then, there's been 2 pieces of research that said that's not good. And that's the issue you've got. Because technique is so individualized, very, very difficult to make recommendations. Because you've got a whole history of bowlers who haven't done all the things that are supposed to be ideal, but being very fast and very successful.
Which difference between what do the experts, the coaches, perceive as ideal way forward, and the papers that you have examined?
Well, interestingly, it's on the thematic networks, the coaches' models of the ideal fast bowling technique pretty much backed up everything that's already been recorded in the papers. But how much of that was what they'd worked out themselves whilst in the field versus what they'd learned on different coaching qualifications and then regurgitated back again because they expected that to be the right answer? Problem. I also created a model of what I think is a core technique, which was useful because it gave some kind of real world understanding. But there were also some misconceptions as well. So there's what I call the myth of the knee drive. So it's a point basically as the arm comes through, this back leg kicks through. There are a lot of coaches out there teaching that as an active component and actually getting to drive their leg through. And the research shows it's actually the result of the upper body. So we're now changing people's techniques and doing some weird stuff. So people kind of half truths, seeing things in action and then gone. So to me, it's about understanding principles of what's going on, collecting stuff, getting ideas, but not then prescribing, going, right, that's the answer. So if we say, you know, we've got this group of fast bowlers, and every one of them have all got dodgy shoulders, so they've all been doing lots of different slow ball variations, then that's something that we need to look at. But if we say, right, the fastest two bowlers do this, therefore everybody else has to do that, that's a problem.
And why then do you suggest
Girish. Get your hand up, Girish.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can't hear you, buddy. Okay, well, I can read you notes here. So, interesting presentation. Are there any plans to undertake research to overcome the limitation of existing studies in this area? Have the findings been communicated to the ECB and the counties, etc.? So, last part first. Yes, I've spoken to the ECB Coach Education Department, and we're looking at. I've already started to be involved in some of their stuff, particularly on the teaching of biomechanics in cricket. So, there's already work kind of going ahead of that. Other stuff going on in terms of limitations and stuff. Following being at that conference, I've spoken to 4 or 5 other researchers, and there's a discussion of potentially putting a paper together to outline almost like a blueprint of what ideal fast bowling research should look like. So like a consensus statement, maybe even for basis. So we're in early kind of stages of looking at that and where to go, because realistically nobody's going to get anywhere near the gold standard because the technology is, as far as I'm aware, is not there yet. But having a batter, having an umpire, putting some netting up, or certainly at least having bowlers working to us, here's a scenario. I certainly think that could be done. Marcus?
There's this notion of analysis outside of the laboratory, which involves a number of steps. I guess the step that you want to understand is the very last one.
Yeah. Well, no. So I even if it's just a case of replicating what's already done, stick it on a cricket field and put a batter and umpire there and have a game context, and that's doable. You're going to have to obviously some decent insurance policy and stuff like that for all of the cameras and so on. And it's going to be a little bit false because they're going to obviously physically potentially get in the way. But there's no reason why we can't do more game related stuff. The size is an issue. We've got that, and AWRC, they're just not big enough. There are not many labs anywhere. Whereas we've got ARC, brilliant. 4 force plates in parallel. It's the only place in the world where potentially I can do my next study that I'm looking at in terms of the follow through. but I can't do anything like I want to do in terms of design because the force plates in the middle of the floor, they're not going to have a 20-yard run, they're not going to have 22 yards to bowl on, and I can't put a bat in the middle. So it's tricky. So I think it's going to be kind of a step by step. So it's going right. We can do this much of it in here. We can go outside and do that, but then we lose some of the other stuff. So I can go out on the cricket pitch. I'm not going to get any force plate data. But if I can create almost like a blueprint of the forces within a lab setting, and then look at them on outside on a pitch. So I did a study with one of our students at La Trobe, who used IMUs. So they were looking at GPS data and IMUs during game situations.
Just online searches and search
Yeah.
PhD. Her work was on estimating ground reactions, so three-dimensional components.
Yeah.
Vertical, so there might well be some.
Yeah, Daniel Epifano was apparently also doing some research with us now. He was the student in the Trobe, so yeah, that's the kind of stuff where I want to go with that. Perfect. Need to chat with him. So yeah, we'll look at that. Forgot the lady's name. She's in Amsterdam. I'm a researcher. But we're looking at neural networks as well as a possibility with IMUs and looking at variation, even if it's just sending a mass over again, and how that then changes as well. It's basically recording the variation. Because as it stands, there's very little out there that says people change, which is clearly not true.
Some higher spec IMUs as well, which I think she's just about to start using those.
Well, definitely. So, because Daniel's one, at least to a certain point, helped prove one of my theories that, to me, I think most spinal injuries occur from release of what I call back foot recontact. Massive phase of deceleration and directional change. So, from Epifano's study, we found that the ground reaction force, well, tibial deceleration, was by far greater at back foot recontact than anyone else. So that kind of fits with that quite nicely as well. So yeah, anything whereby we can get people in situ with reliable data, we can measure to A, show variance, and B, show this latter part of the phase that's not being recorded. That's what we're after. Questions on there?
Really like the presentation. I'm just really curious. I spent a lot of time there talking about replacing match play situations. Is that where we're seeing the players break down in a match situation rather than training environments?
Yeah.
So it's,
but you've got workload and intensity spikes that are also really closely related to that as well. So you can't necessarily go, oh, it's that game situation or whatever. But obviously, intensity tends to go up as people try harder again. So it's just the variations that you get naturally occurring within a game and not recorded. Now, it could be that that natural variation makes not a great deal of difference. We just don't know. We just have you run up there, ball as fast as you can, and we record it, and that's fast bowling, which isn't what happens.
Why do you suggest to them that ecological design is not something to follow? I understood that. Because what you are suggesting at the end, that is really to have a valid ecological design, not that it's not a.
So I'm arguing that we need to take into account what a fast bowler is going to do in a game. That needs to be seen in the experimental design. Because I firmly believe that the game scenario will have an impact on what the bowlers do. And if that has an impact on what the bowlers do, biomechanics is recording what they do. So if we're getting a very different do, we're getting very different variables. Right. Okay.
very much. Okay, for the second presentation, I will present a piece of research about the impact of the London 2012 Olympic Games as calculated through the Active People Survey. The idea was to consider what was the situation on participation around 4 years before the Olympics and then after the Olympic Games. The data sets were consistent in terms of the sample and in terms of the questions. The questions were almost identical. And the sample size was around 500 people per local authority, among adults 16 plus. We compared participation measures which are consistent with moderate intensity, including recreational walking and cycling. In most cases, these participation measures give a flat trend. So if we consider this on 1 times 30, at least once participating once a week, and we draw the participation rates of adults participating once a week, we'll see that the Olympic Games really, one week, do not change much the participation rate. There is a slight upward movement, but nothing very radical. So when all the research was happening after the Olympic Games, most people had the consensus that nothing really happened to affect the participation rates. And this research paper tries to change this perception in terms of what is happening if we consider a very frequent participation. So that is 3 times per 30 minutes per week, which is quite intensive. But we can see here the actual. So these are the participation rates per quarter and the actual participation rates as recorded in the Active People Survey. And what is different when we consider this very intensive participation is that instead of having a flat, there are variations. This is mainly seasonality when it goes up and down. But if you do not consider the seasonality, but the general trend, how this is going, you can see that at this point near the Olympics, we have a shoot up of the trend. This does not happen when we consider less intensive participation rates. And if we see the same diagram, but with the seasonality taken away and adjusted, so this is seasonally adjusted time series, we can see that at around this point again, we have a very big effect. So these are actually data. At this point where the Olympics starts, we put a trend on the data set. Can you see? Yeah. Okay.
widespread.
Oh, sorry, I don't know what's happening.
My presentation still there.
Share.
So it's just the way it was there first. Do you want to go? Tip mine. Might be my still there.
This one.
So if you got mine off. Yeah, both of you got mine.
Um,
Okay, is that okay?
I think so. I hope so.
Yes, thank you.
Yanish, can you see it?
Lots and lots.
Okay, all right. So, continuing from previously, these are actual rates. Now, if at the time of the Olympics we fit a prediction line of how this participation rate would have progressed if the Olympics were not in place, then this line is followed by these dots here underneath. So the area between the line at the bottom and the line on the top, geometrically speaking, is actually the legacy of the Olympic Games. It's the extra participation following this definition that occurs because of the Olympic Games. The problem is that this is very obviously very real, but it is in contradiction with the less intensive definitions of participation. So if we don't follow this definition, but we follow once per week, this does not happen. And the only conclusion from this is that the reason that this is happening is that mostly existing participants participate more often in sport following the Olympics. So the Olympics fail to attract new participants from the non-sport sectors, from the non-sport people into sport participation. This is consistent with a lot of research that's happened around inspiration, where we could see that if you want to bring into sport non-sport people, then it's best to use non-sport people as instruments. Following that, the first conclusion is that, okay, we have the Olympic Games, we have the existing participants participating more. Therefore, if you get an intensive definition of sport, you have a huge increase in participation. But that means that all the structures that we have in sport, including all the sport inequalities, are going to be amplified. So the most classic sport inequality is that men participate more than women. So if you have Olympics or a mega event where this is happening, then you will expect that this inequality between the genders will also be amplified. The same is for income. This is the expectation to start with. And obviously the inequalities among ethnic minorities. So in the following this research, we compared the participation rates among different groups, and one that it's easily explained in terms of descriptively is what happens when you have young people. So this is the overall participation as it was before. And the moment you consider what is happening to young people, then the whole diagram shifts upwards. So you can see that there is this the same effect, but on a larger scale for the younger people. So the groups that we considered were broke down according to age, gender, socioeconomic status, full-time and part-time, race, education, health, and children in household. I'm not going to consider all of them in detail, but some examples to see how this scenario plays out. So if we consider gender, the research framework is logistic regressions, which can really do a good job in terms of describing what affects the participation rates. And when we have as a base males, the females, if you consider on the left-hand side, you have the situation before the Olympics. On the right-hand side, you have the situation after the Olympics. So if there is an increase in inequality, of gender inequality following the Olympics, that should go down as it went, the odds ratio. If there is an improvement against inequalities, if there is better participation of females compared to males following the Olympics, that should go near 1, should increase. Yeah. And in this case, there is a decline in the odds ratio of females to participate. Therefore, as expected, the gender inequalities following the Olympics deteriorated because more people, the existing participants, participated more. The same happened with the socioeconomic categories, where the odds ratio to participate increased quite considerably in the higher managerial roles. So we have that usually there is a greater propensity of the richer people to participate. So the higher your income is, the better the participation rate. And this was amplified following the Olympics. So all these expected inequalities that increase following a mega event actually materialized. And to our surprise, the one that didn't was when we consider the case of race, as it was labeled in the active people survey. So for this, we have as a base the white British population, which was the majority in the sample. And originally, these two categories, white, other, and mixed race, were not significant at the 5% level, but this was approximately significant at the 10% level, the mixed case. And we see that both Asian and Black categories, the odds ratios to participate increased. In the case of Black people, increased quite considerably, which means that following the Olympics, but the probability to find a Black person to participate in sport compared to a white British person has increased very much. It has increased actually by almost 50%, 40%. So this was a very, very good case that the practical effect of the Olympic Games on the participation of ethnic minorities was very, very positive, which was against all the story that could be unfolded by the increase of the intensity of participation of the existing sports participants. One reason for this, I mean, this is a result and a conclusion. But one reason that this could have happened can be probably highlighted by some research that was conducted both in Germany and in the UK, where it was found that there is a causal effect between a mega event and role models in sport and increase in membership of the sports clubs. And if that happens, if there is an increase in membership as a result of a successful sport event, then that probably will mean that there is an increase in sports participation without having highlighted that, without having actually found out that this is the case. But we know that it is true for membership. If you have a successful Olympics, you expect to have more members in sports clubs. So there may be a case of participation because of role models, and that could actually affect more the ethnic minorities of Black people and mixed race people because of the success in the Olympic Games considered in 2012. So the conclusions in general are that the Olympic year improved the odds of participation in young people, males, higher socioeconomic occupation, Black and mixed race minorities. And in general, the Olympic Games improve the participation of people that are already participants. The inspiration of non-participants come from non-sport people and policies of inclusion. But one has to consider also at the end that a big part of this inspiration comes from the role models that come through the sport event. So if you have a successful event with a lot of people from ethnic minorities showing this success, then that probably reflects to the ethnic population. That's it. Any questions? Well, it was from our article, Giddish. Well, these findings are in the public domain. So there is an article published in a peer review article with this theme. The interpretation of this following the article is new. I mean, it's a possible interpretation. We know that the intensity, obviously, the intensity, if you have an equality and you have you impose on this inequality a more intensive participation rate, then the existing participants will just reproduce the same inequality at a higher rate. That is just mathematical. The other thing, the surprise that the ethnic minorities do not follow this general trend, that is a question why this is happening. And one possible explanation is that they reflect or they are inspired more from a sporting success in the Olympic Games. But this is only speculation. I cannot back this up with research. It's speculation based on the findings of other research papers. Yeah? Okay. Anything else? Yes, Simon?
Yeah, Themis, thanks for that. Can I give an alternative explanation? Might be this, the work that Girish and I did on tackling racism and racial sport from ethnic diversity communities, on average 10 years younger than their white British counterparts. So given that the increase in participation that we report happens particularly strongly in young people, it's possible and by effect of age, as Latin Asia.
No. These are based on observations in a multivariate model, which includes age. So age should be abstracted from the effect of age should be really taken care of from the age variable. And this is ethnic communities before the Olympics, 4 years before, and after. So this what you say can be valid if we assume that in the ethnic communities the participation rate in the ethnic communities, or the participants within the ethnic communities are much younger following the Olympics than compared to before. Yeah, because we compare the ethnic communities before and after. So unless there is a shift from an older population to a much younger population within the ethnic community, that cannot be demonstrated. But even so, it should be captured by the age variable. But it is a very interesting point. I mean, if there is a shift in the age within the Black and mixed race people towards a younger generation, towards younger people, and this shift is very, very big one, then it will not be captured sufficiently by the logistic model, and then this increase in the odds ratio will occur without being accounted for from the age variable. I don't know, does it make sense? Do you have evidence that this, I mean, do you have evidence of such a shift?
Not a shift, just a structural difference.
Anything else? Anything else, Girish? Okay. Okay, in this case, I would like to thank you very much for being present. Hopefully, we can improve upon today's presentations in the next in the period following. The next seminar will be in 3 weeks' time, if I remember well, and the same room. And I hope that you'll get sufficient quality to follow this up. Thank you very much.
Thank you.